Ukraine is deep in a corruption scandal, investigated by its anti-corruption bureau, NABU, linking very high-profile politicians to all sorts of illegal money schemes. What a coincidence that this is coming out now that the US is trying to exert power over Kiev to accept Trump's so-called 28-point peace plan. Here to make sense of this is again Professor Ivan Katchanovski. Professor Katchanovski is a Ukrainian-Canadian political scientist at the University of Ottawa and the author of the books The Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, The Mass Killing That Changed the World, and most recently he published The Russia-Ukraine War and Its Origins. Both of these books are available online and for free, by the way. They are open access, so you can download them, and the links will be in the description below. But now, Professor Katchanovski, welcome.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much for making time again. You are one of the voices that has been trying in academia to really work through the sources of what is going on politically in these very tragic circumstances. And most recently, let's start with NABU and this corruption scandal. I mean, Ukraine has not precisely been famous for anti-corruption efforts, but now NABU is cracking down on even very senior officials, and you wrote a Facebook post in which you actually also pointed out the connections of NABU with the FBI. Could you give us an overview of what is happening and what the link between the US and NABU is?
So I think in recent week or so, there were two major developments in Ukraine. One was this new peace plan, which was suggested by Donald Trump to Zelensky, and which is now again a top story in the news. And another story which was just preceded this, another announcement of this plan, was a corruption scandal in Ukraine, which was a major story in Ukraine, and it was to a lesser extent it was not as well reported by the Western media, and there was almost no reaction from American government and politicians. But I think this is also a major story and I think this is also closely linked to the peace plan, which is now discussed by Trump and Zelensky because of impact of this corruption scandal on Zelensky and his close associates. So this scandal happened on Monday, November 11. When National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which is called NABU, launched investigations and charges against top officials in Ukraine and people who are closely connected to Zelensky. And so all of them were basically closely connected to Zelensky. And these charges involved first Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, so Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, Chernyshov, who is again closely related to Zelensky, and his wife, again godfather of children, and so and also like personal friend. You have also two members of Ukrainian government who were implicated in this corruption scandal. One was Minister of Justice, another was Minister of Energy. So they had to resign because, or not actually, they did not resign, but basically they were dismissed by the parliament of Ukraine. But again, there is no serious consequences afterwards. And you have also business persons who were very closely connected to Zelensky from the time when Zelensky was not yet president of Ukraine. One of the persons who founded and actually who owned Zelensky's comedy studio called Quartal 95, or Quarter 95, basically, which is translation from Ukrainian. This business person or businessman was called Timur Minjin. He is, again, he was not very well known in Ukraine, but he was very closely linked to Zelensky because of his business ties, and but also because of the kind of personal relationship with Zelensky. And there were stories that Zelensky celebrated his birthday in a room, again in a very elite apartment in Kiev, which was owned by this person. And there were also other kind of ties going back to the times when both of them were working for Ukrainian oligarch called Igor Kolomoisky, who's now in prison. And Timur Mindish was basically a low-level kind of person who was just kind of working for Kolomoisky, and he made again ties and connections to Zelensky and to Kolomoisky, and he basically after the start of the war he basically was able to get very rich by getting a lot of money from a state company which is called Energoatom, which is basically responsible for nuclear power plants in Ukraine. And this was again illegal scheme in which NABU published tapes of recordings of this person, along with many other top officials of Ukrainian government, and I mentioned some of them already, but also other people who are close to Zelensky. And so this is very large-scale corruption, which is, I think, for the first time became public in Ukraine. But it was very clear that this was, again, not just accident. This is just tip of the iceberg of corruption. And Zelensky is, I think, very closely linked to this corruption. So in this case, this person who, again, Timur Mindich and another associate, they were able to flee Ukraine or just to leave Ukraine with assistance, obviously, from the government. They received information about NABU investigation, and they were able to basically leave Ukraine and went to Poland and then to Israel. So now they are not in Ukraine, but scandal was very significant, and this implicated not only, as I mentioned, close associates of Zelensky, but also him as well. And there are reports that these tapes include conversations by Zelensky with Mindich in his apartment, talking about, for instance, Ukrainians in not very nice terms, basically, and also about ordinary Ukrainians, not very nice terms, basically, and also the other kind of people who are connected to the scandal, including a very important person called Yermak, who is, I think, a second person in terms of power in Ukraine, and even acts as a president of Ukraine when Zelensky is just often just reads his speeches. And this person, Yermak, was just leading delegation of Ukraine for this peace talks in Geneva with United States senior officials. And this is also very important because this scandal, corruption scandal, made position and power of Zelensky very much more limited than before. So basically, he was dictator before, and nobody can challenge him. There was no real opposition, no free media, and suddenly you have this agency, anti-corruption agency, which existed for quite a long time, but had no such kind of investigations of such scale, and suddenly they release this information, which is kind of significantly impacted popularity of Zelensky and his ability to again exercise power in Ukraine. And this has also had very significant effect on his stance on war in Ukraine, because he now basically accepted possibility of having a peace deal with Russia, which was not, I think, very likely before. So this is, I think, very closely connected to the current efforts by Trump to also to kind of make Zelensky or try to force him to sign a peace deal with Russia, which is, I think, another important issue and a very serious issue as well.
May I just ask, because, NABU has been as an institution in the media before. If I'm not wrong, it was around September or October when Mr. Zelensky tried to crack down on NABU and crack down on the Anti-Corruption Bureau, right? And change it. And then there were suddenly mass protests in the street by the NGOs. And you have also researched the NGOs, especially in connection to the Maidan protests, right? That doesn't happen. Mr. Zelensky backed down, said, I'm not going to change NABU. And now NABU is cracking down on Mr. Zelensky's inner circle at a very opportune timing in order to twist his arm to actually give in, while at the same time, of course, Mr. Zelensky's the right-wing nationalists who are still threatening, who threatened his life before, are on the other side. Can you talk about the connection between NABU and the United States?
Yes, I think this is a reason basically why NABU was able to launch this investigation in the first place and make it public, because there is no another structure besides far right in Ukraine another organization in Ukraine besides far-right, like neo-Nazi-led Azov, and other far-right organizations which are able to act independently from Zelensky government. So he basically eliminated everything. He took control of the parliament of Ukraine. He took control of the state security service of Ukraine, again, equivalent of FBI in Ukraine. He took control of his own faction in the parliament. So he also controls like the minister of Ukraine, entire government of Ukraine. He controls also military. He issues order to Chusisky, who is again supposed to be again a top military official in Ukraine, but basically Zelensky issued a lot of military orders, specifically not to withdraw Ukrainian forces from Pokrovsk and Mirnograd area, which are now basically encircled by Russian, and there is a very significant kind of losses of Ukrainian soldiers who were encircled for a significant period of time, and now this is no real possibility of them to escape from this this area. And so Zelensky basically was regarded as, so he basically regarded himself as a kind of dictator of Ukraine who has who would stay in power as long as the war would continue in Ukraine. And so for this reason he tried to kind of extend his his war in Ukraine and not to make any peace deal. But the NABU agency is not just any other agency in Ukraine. It was created, organized specifically with strong influence and strong participation of the United States and other Western governments. And it had, since then, it had basically, it was regarded in Ukraine as an agency which represents interests of the United States and other Western countries, speaking from European Union countries. So this was regarded as a tool, basically, of the West, and specifically of the United States, and a tool also to control Ukrainian politics and influence Ukrainian politics by using corruption as a way to do this, because Ukrainian politics is, I think, one of the most corrupt politics in the world. And this was long before even the Russia-Ukraine war, and Zelensky is no exception. And so this is why NABU, NABU was created again and as independent from Zelensky. It was not controlled fully by Zelensky, so he was not able to take control over NABU. He tried to do this in summer of this year, after information about investigations of his close associates became public, and there was also photo of a golden toilet made public by one of the members of Ukrainian parliament from the apartment of this associate of Zelensky, Timon Mindich. So this was a big scandal, and Zelensky tried to basically to take control over NABU and a related agency called SAP, a Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office. And so he issued a new law overnight, basically, which stripped NABU from its powers and basically put under control of by Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine, which was a pocket agency of Zelensky, because he controls Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine. And so Zelensky believes that this would be, again, a very fast way to resolve this issue and to eliminate the influence of NABU, but he did not I think took into consideration that this is an agency which has support of the United States and also European Union countries. And so after his attempt to do this, there was immediate reaction by the Western governments, specifically by European Union countries, but there was no such reaction, public reaction by United States, but maybe, I think, private reaction, I think, was very likely. And there were protests against Zelensky and his attempt to take control over NABU, and he failed to do this, so he had to step back and to cancel this law. And he also attempted to claim that NABU was acting as Russian agents, which is again standard tactic in Ukraine. Whenever anybody says anything against Zelensky, they become automatically Russian agents. So this is.
Sorry, may I just ask, when was NABU created? Which year?
I think I don't remember, but this was created, I think, after Maidan.
After Maidan.
Yeah, when Ukraine became client state of the United States. So this led to kind of basically United States government controlling Ukraine kind of as a client state and acting as a patron of Ukraine, and this again they created this as after Maidan in 2014. And this is just another manifestation of control of the United States, or kind of influence of the United States and Western countries over Ukrainian politics and government. And so this agency is again very important, just kind of just example of how this agency is connected to the US. There is an FBI agent who permanently stationed in this agency. And this was reported by Ukrainian media that just recently that this person from FBI, he has access to all kind of investigations by NABU. So this is again just shows about real independence of this agency, which is so you have basically an FBI official who is kind of stationed in this agency and has access to all these investigations, which means that this investigation, which was made public against Zelensky associates, could not have been made public without or could not have been conducted without again agreement from FBI or from the U.S. government. So this is under specifically Trump administration. So this is why Zelensky was not able to take control over NABU, and this is why his power diminished. And I think this had consequences that he now has to kind of try to accept this agreement, which was issued by Trump initially as 28 points, but now kind of Zelensky again tries to change this agreement and make it kind of favorable to himself, which I think might make it not practical.
This is really fascinating because, like, it is a proven fact that the FBI has a permanent office, which is based upon a state agreement with Ukraine that this person can be stationed there and have full access to NABU and its investigations, like permanently, like not just remotely, but on the ground, just being integrated. And NABU itself, can you explain to me again, like, what is its structure? Because, okay, you have Zelensky, who's the president, who oversees the government of Ukraine, and it oversees, of course, also all the ministries. NABU must be part of one of the ministries, but how is it that NABU is actually independent of, like, let's say, the Minister of Justice or whichever ministry it's under?
No, it's separate, totally separate from the government. This is why
Totally.
and it was created, so basically leadership of NABU. Again, if you have a separate agency, so typically in Ukraine, you would have like Zelensky and his government would just appoint their like person in charge of agency, like they did with State Security Service of Ukraine, as they did with Prosecutor General Office, who basically, which agencies which act basically as a personal kind of security agencies of Zelensky and his kind of personal prosecutor office. But actually, this agency was kind of headed by a person who was selected with the involvement also of the United States and Western countries. There was a special kind of selection process in which you have kind of involvement of experts from Western countries. This was not just decision by Zelensky to appointed the heads of NABU and head of SAP, special kind of prosecutor, special anti-corruption prosecutor office. So basically, he had to accept that he had no control over this agency. So he appointed a deputy. Actually, he was only able to appoint a deputy head of special kind of SAP, which is special anti-corruption prosecutor agency, which is a sister agency of NABU, which is also independent from Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine and not controlled by Zelensky. And this deputy head of SAP, I think it was reported by NABU and by Ukrainian media to have leaked information to Zelensky and his associates about investigation of NABU, and this enabled this associates of Zelensky basically to flee from Ukraine before they would be arrested or charged with such corruption. This is why I think this is quite significant. And besides NABU, kind of, which is, I think there are also reports, for instance, that like in Ukrainian media that another deputy head of NABU was appointed by United States Embassy, so they are basically controlled by the embassy. You had a specific department in the U.S. Embassy, which is called basically department in charge of like law enforcement agencies of Ukraine, and they have power basically and kind of an influence to appoint it also like top officials in this specifically in NABU, and so this is how this agency is called by basically represents interests of United States government and Western governments, and also not controlled by Zelensky. Even so, he wanted to do this, and even just a few days ago, there was publication in Ukrainian media that kind of another kind of basically partner of Zelensky, who is in charge of his office of president, Yermak, wanted after this scandal became public on November 11, he wanted to arrest and charge the head of NABU with state treason, basically. Again, working for Russians, and he gave order to to head of State Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, and to Prosecutor General Office head to Prosecutor General of Ukraine to arrest this person, this head of NABU, and also to arrest and charge with state treason by head of Zelensky faction in the parliament, because parliament members demanded investigation of this scandal. They demanded resignation of Yermak from position of a very powerful position, which is not constitutional position. And so this Yermak, basically acting on behalf of Zelensky, wanted to arrest and charge head of NABU. But he could not do this because of refusal by head of SBU, State Security Service of Ukraine, and refusal by Prosecutor General of Ukraine. And this is not accidental, because they did this in the past. They acted as basically they would arrest politicians, top politicians in Ukraine. They would charge almost anybody. So there was no problem with for them to do this. But now, if you have a kind of head of NABU who has very close ties to the United States, so you have basically even head of SBU, State Security Service of Ukraine, and even again head of Prosecutor General Office, Prosecutor General of Ukraine are not willing to go and act on behalf of Zelensky. Even so, they did this many times before against other politicians and government officials.
So this is a very, very significant power struggle, right, on the top echelons of the institutions that actually hold real power in Ukraine. And some of them are loyal or used to be loyal to Mr. Zelensky, and some of them are now loyal to or afraid of NABU. I just need to clarify again, NABU, so the Ukrainian state is, of course, like on top, the very top is the Ukrainian constitution, right? And the Ukrainian constitution defines the government powers, the executive, then the legislative powers of parliament and the judiciary. And those branches are usually separate. Now, of course, politically, you can create interconnections between them. But NABU, is NABU founded by the legislative? Is it under the legislative branch, or is NABU now even part of the a separate branch within the constitution? Where is NABU legally speaking under the constitution?
No, I think when Ukrainian constitution was adopted in 1996, there was no NABU, and so NABU was not in the constitution, and I don't think there was any constitutional amendment about NABU and a related agency called SAP. But I think that's why they are kind of unique in the world, because I don't know many other countries. I think there may be something in Romania, something close, but I don't know any such such agencies in Canada, for instance, or in the United States or any other Western countries, because they would not accept this, basically, because this is unconstitutional, and this is just shows that again, Ukraine is not a sovereign state as it is often presented by the Western media and politicians. This is actually, you have strong influence by such agencies which are not part of a constitutional system of Ukraine, and they are actually kind of they are separate, basically, and they are influenced by the United States. and backed by the United States and Western countries. And even constitution, even so, again, in constitution of Ukraine, you have all this kind of independence of judiciary and so on. This is not in practice how it works. Judiciary in Ukraine is totally controlled by Zelensky, with the exception of NABU and SAP. So this is, again, he can issue orders to judges, what kind of decisions to make. This, again, kind of, and he issues, as I mentioned, orders to kind of SBU head and head of Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine, so to whom to charge with what kind of crimes. So he has power to do this, and the constitution is totally disregarded. And even Zelensky stated at the start of Russian invasion that he said the constitution is on pause, basically on pause in Ukraine. So basically he even said that constitution is not being active right now.
Where is NABU getting its money from? Does Parliament, is it a separate budget point in the budget that Parliament passes that then goes to NABU?
I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure about I think money exactly and what sources of funding, but I would assume that again there are a lot of Western kind of agencies like USAID, for instance, in the past, and similar agencies in the European Union which provide money, basically grants and other funding to NABU, because after Maidan there was open funding of Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine by United States and by US Embassy. Specifically, so you have basically Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine funded by United States and government and Embassy of the United States. You have also police, National Police of Ukraine was created and funded with involvement of the United States and other Western countries. So this is all basically agencies in Ukraine, and even there was publication in New York Times recently which said that even State Security Service of Ukraine (SBU) was and military intelligence agency of Ukraine were also basically created from scratch. Kind of some of the sections, kind of some of their branches were created from scratch and in kind of by the United States intelligence agencies and also by British intelligence agencies. So this is again basically you have very strong influence of United States and Western countries on these agencies, but I'm not sure about funding, but I think very likely that they receive again I think almost definitely they receive funding from Western kind of countries, Western states.
It's just fascinating because it's such a lesson in modern, neo-colonial power grab, because what this means basically is that on the one hand we have the NGO space in Ukraine that is used with US funding in order to initiate certain popular push for whatever, and on the other hand we have an anti-corruption bureau that is a fully owned subsidiary of the United States, which acts like a guillotine on the appointed personnel, right? Whoever goes in knows that if they fall too far out of line, the guillotine is going to come down on them and somebody else will go in, and you cannot escape that because corruption is baked into the political system. So whoever controls the anti-corruption bureau controls the hard guillotine of making sure that personnel that gets out of hand can be replaced. That's fascinating.
Yes, and this is why it shows just power of Western countries, specifically United States, on Ukrainian politics and decisions. And this is not accidental. This is what I describe in my book, which is just published about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins, which is freely available. This is open access. And this is, I think, also very important because in addition to these institutions like NABU, you have anti-corruption NGOs, which are also controlled basically by the United States and funded by the United States USAID and other agencies and US Embassy. They are very closely connected to United States, and this is they also often act on behalf of United States in kind of exposing corruption of Zelensky, and Zelensky tried also to go against them, and he recently even but basically sent or tried to launch a criminal case against the head of this anti-corruption NGO who was closely connected to this with US Embassy in Kiev, and tried to mobilize him in the military service, basically in the military, which is again and also very important. Just another example of the power of this kind of structure is that all the NGOs which are funded by the Western governments received exemption from mobilization, from being mobilized for military service during the Russia-Ukraine war. So there was specific exemption given to all these NGOs, people who work in these NGOs funded by the West, by the Western governments, and I think also kind of organizations like Soros Foundation, so they could not be mobilized. And this is another example. This is basically Zelensky can pressure anybody and send basically use just force to mobilize ordinary Ukrainians who would be like kind of caught on the street on a public location and just used by violence, beaten, and even some of them are killed kind of during this mobilization, and they will be sent to military without again any kind of even medical check and without any consent, and many of them flee after this. But he cannot do this even if he wanted. He cannot do this against NGOs because they're also linked to the Western countries, to the Western government. So this is why I think he could not do this. And I think another important issue which is not yet certain or not clear is why this happened right now. Because this is happened at the time when there was negotiations between Russia and the United States about this 28-point plan to end the war in Ukraine, which is again which started I think in the end of October, and this plan became just public recently, but it was negotiated before, just I think a few weeks before, and at the same time again when this plan was just close to being made public or to present it to Zelensky publicly, this scandal happened in Ukraine. So a lot of people in Ukraine assume this was just a tactic by the West, by United States government administration to try to pressure Zelensky and make him more kind of to put him in weaker position and to show that he is basically he has to be dependent on the United States support, and he would have limited power and refusal to not accept such a deal from the United States. And so he basically now shows his willingness to do this, even so he rejected original plan with 28 points. And I think there is another connection to this plan because according to the media reports in the West, specifically another official which is close to Zelensky, Rustem Umerov, he actually head of National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine and former defense minister. Actually, he wanted during negotiations, he wanted to insert agreement. He wanted to insert in this agreement, in this plan, a point which would eliminate kind of investigation of all aid received by Ukraine, audit of all aid received by Ukraine during this war with Russia, and he instead inserted suggested to insert a point which would give an all amnesty for all actions of all parties of this conflict during the war, which means this would give amnesty to Zelensky and his kind of associates for all decisions and all corruption which was exposed by NABU, NABU, and the United States agreed to this, and they included this point in this plan, 28 plan, and I'm not sure if this is survived in the latest version of this plan, but I think this is not coincidental because Umerov, who again very close to Zelensky and was previously Minister of Defense of Ukraine and also now head of National Security and Defense Council, he also was on the tapes recorded as a part of this corruption scandal, and he was specifically mentioned by NABU during their kind of presentation of their charges against associates of Zelensky, that he was influenced by these people close to Zelensky, specifically in corruption scandal. And so, and he knows that this is his name is mentioned there, and this is why I think when he went to the United States, a lot of people assume that he kind of again was exposed by this scandal, and this is why I think he agreed to this plan or kind of and accept this provision that there will be amnesty given to kind of to all people from involved in this corruption, including himself.
I see it like you. I just wonder, what does this tell us about this peace process? If we now learn that also inside Ukraine, the United States is starting to use the guillotine to threaten the top personnel personally, if they do not fall in line with the plan, then they will be chopped off. Does that tell us that the United States now is at a much more serious point in trying to hammer through this peace agreement than they were before? Because the big question to me is the United States serious about trying to bring an end to the fighting, or is it just a charade in order, to keep the Russians guessing and keep everybody kind of on edge of what the peace president wants to do?
I think this depends on specific members of Trump administration and other members of U.S. Again, senior politicians in the United States, specifically also members of the Congress, because Trump, he stated that he wanted to end this war, and I think he acts in a way to end this war as soon as possible. And for him, it's most important to end this war, and so he but also he knows that Ukraine is a client state of the United States, so he cannot just leave Ukraine and to see what would happen, as happened with Afghanistan after United States have to flee. Basically, U.S. forces had to flee Afghanistan after Taliban takeover, and there was agreement also signed before on the Trump. So basically he wants to protect and still make Ukraine a client state of the United States after the end of the war, but also to reach agreement and to end this war. But there are also members of his administration, like I think Mark Rubio and also this General Kellogg and other members, I think, who are very kind of anti any effort to end this war. They want this war to continue, and there are also very powerful politicians like Senator Lindsey Graham, them and other politicians, Democratic senators and other politicians, members of U.S. government, and also a lot of basically United States media, mainstream media, and also specifically also European Union as a whole, leadership of European Union and leaders of France, Germany, and Italy, and United Kingdom, and like Finland and Sweden and so on. They want also this war to continue. So for them, they want to this plan to fail. Basically, they oppose this plan by Trump in initial form of 28 points. So they now want to make this plan basically, changed, and they, I think, succeeded to large extent after negotiations. And this plan now basically eliminated all provisions, important provisions, which were crucial for Russia, position, like non-NATO membership of Ukraine, no Western military forces, and limitation on Ukrainian size of military force, and also the withdrawal from Donbass, part of Donbass which is controlled by Ukrainian government, and recognition of these territories as basically which are occupied and annexed by Russia as a Russian de facto. So now this agreement and also other provisions like about Russian language and church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and also about non-Nazi ideology. This I think provisions were removed in latest iteration of this plan after modifications following talks with Zelensky and Zelensky representatives and the European Union and other European leaders. So I think for this reason, I don't think that this plan would succeed now, because Russia is almost like 100% would not sign and would not accept this plan with such provisions. So this means now, again, this the choice for Trump would be either to try to to use his leverage against Zelensky, and specifically via NABU, which is, I think, just one example of such leverage. Even again, not publicly, because publicly neither Trump nor other members of his administration publicly mentioned this scandal, but I think they know this and they have a strong influence over NABU. So I think Trump can make NABU go after, for instance, if Zelensky would defuse this plan, he could go after Yermak, who's on these tapes and mentioned by head of NABU, as his name was Ali Baba. In these tapes, they use all this such names, and so he was named Ali Baba, but specifically he was mentioned on these tapes as involved in corruption. So there were demands by Ukrainian parliament, even from Zelensky faction, to fire him by Zelensky, and Zelensky refused to do this. So, and he sent instead him to negotiate with the United States. And also, I think there are also, as I mentioned, reports in the media that Zelensky's name is also, and voice also is on these tapes, and specifically discussing corruption, all this kind of illegal enrichment of him and his associates in the scheme, and also talking about ordinary Ukrainians basically as fools and kind of how it's easy to fool them and so on. And this is again would be major scandal in Ukraine, shock to Ukrainians because also, and so shock to the West because you have this creation of image of Zelensky as a new Churchill, as kind of as a Western kind of new George Washington who just acts as kind of as hero, just is self kind of has sacrificed his life and his all effort and all the money, all his kind of future, basically for trying to save Ukraine. And but actually he was enriching himself and his associates because this Mindich is not I think the person who is actually was head of the scheme. He was I think just representative of Zelensky and Yermak, which is I think almost definitely the case. So that's why Trump administration, if they wanted, they can just make pressure on Zelensky and his kind of other members of the government like Umerov and Yermak, and make them again be kind of more willing to accept this plan, because otherwise they would face even kind of they would face loss of power in Ukraine and revolt from their own faction, and also after this information would be made public. But I think it's not clear if Trump would be willing to do this actually. And you see just in the last few hours there were other tapes made public in the United States, and this is conversations between Witkov, who is a special representative of Donald Trump on negotiations with Russia, and Russian foreign advisor to Putin, Ushakov, in which they discuss this peace plan, original 28-point peace plan, and the same was another tape was released in a form of transcript by Bloomberg about a phone call between Kirill Dmitriev, who is a representative of Putin and who visited the United States to discuss this plan, and Ushakov again about this plan. So this is actually an example in which actually I think very likely U.S. intelligence trying to kind of use leverage and stop this plan and stop Donald Trump from making kind of this plan being implemented by kind of using this kind of compromise. But they have such tapes from Ukraine, and even they have much more information from Ukraine about corruption, but they never do this again until very recently, until this scandal happened. So I think if they wanted, they could have done this, but I think they do this now in the United States themselves, trying to do this opposite and stop this plan by Trump to being implemented, and kind of, and this is I think very likely they would succeed in this, because now it will be very tough for Trump to kind of to try to pressure Zelensky and try to again to make again this plan workable, and if modifications which were demanded by Zelensky would be included in this new iteration of this plan, Putin then would not accept this, and war would continue. But I think Trump has power and influence in Ukraine trying to achieve this, and I mentioned this in my book. This is the most realistic scenario how this war would end kind of sooner, is for United States to use leverage over Ukrainian government and Zelensky, and basically force them to end this war by making peace deal, which would be which would be actually in the interest of Ukraine, because again there is no real possibility for Ukraine defeating Russia, and the longer war would continue, the more casualties would be, and the more the devastation of Ukraine would be, and any term of peace deal after in the future would become much more detrimental to Ukraine compared to terms of current peace deal, which and the same happened with Istanbul peace deal in 2022.
No, you're absolutely right. The thing though is, what your explanation also shows is that we cannot be sure who actually holds the power. I mean, when we say the United States controls Ukraine, the problem is the United States itself is not under central control, because the question is, like, if NABU is basically controlled by the FBI, then that would put Tulsi Gabbard as the person who has a direct should have the most direct influence over this. But are you aware of other institutions, U.S. institution, exerting influence over NABU, like, let's say, the CIA? Because we know the CIA is not auditable. The CIA has the CIA can conceal all actions it wants, even from the U.S. Senate. It's a state within a state. Are we, because I think it's correct, we now see also that inside the United States, we have a civil war about how to continue the Ukraine war. And we have different institutions, factions, that are not under Donald Trump's control, that are fighting for influence over what's going to happen. And this is now influence over NABU and influence over the NGOs in order to pressure Zelensky in one way or the other. Do you know who else is involved in the power struggle in the U.S. over controlling NABU and the NGOs?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't have access to like intelligence information, so I do not know about the role of U.S. intelligence. But I think this very key information published in Ukrainian media that U.S. embassy has strong influence over NABU and other anti-corruption. And this is basically State Department, which is controlled by Mark Rubio, who actually became involved in negotiations, and he is more kind of aligned with neoconservatives and people who want to kind of who do not want to have this peace deal on kind of on the terms which are realistic and kind of and concession to reality. He basically, I think, in his actions, he led this negotiations in Geneva and accepted a lot of changes, which are now made this plan not, I think, realistic with such changes, and so this is why I think. So this is one example in which it's not just kind of as a direct line of a connection. NABU is just controlled by Trump or or FBI. This is kind of United States, basically a state, as a similar applies to control over or kind of state kind of relationship between client state of Ukraine and as the United States, and because and also other Western countries, this is not just one person or kind of one organization. This is like how to say state to state relationship. In addition to this, also you have influence and kind of this is like joint stock company in which you have also. Different politicians, different agencies have their kind of stake in this agency, so they have a say in this agency what they can do and influence over them. And this is not only limited to the United States. European Union also has such influence, but less influence than compared to US. And there was a report in the Ukrainian media that after this scandal was public, a representative of European Union in Ukraine met with head of NABU and told him not to release any other kind of information public about this scandal, not to implicate any other kind of politicians and officials in Ukraine, basically to stop this. And this has happened. And afterwards, after this day, there were no new revelations, basically, by NABU. Even so, Ukrainian media reported there are many other like senior politicians, as I mentioned. Just a second person in Ukraine, Yermak, and Yermak, kind of who is a close partner of Zelensky, and kind of. And going back also to his time before the war in entertainment industry, basically, and also reported to be involved in this corruption. There are no such investigations, even so there were reports that he would be charged by NABU for large-scale corruption in this case. And Tucker Carlson recently wrote on social media, on Twitter, on X, that Wall Street Journal has information about large-scale corruption by Yermak. And they do not publish this information for a few months. Even so, they have such information, and they do this specifically also to kind of prolong this war in Ukraine. This is, I think, very clear that you have a lot of other powerful politicians and government officials and agencies, both in the United States and in the West, in the European Union, who do not want to again, they end this war and they use kind of influence of a NABU in opposite direction. So they also can kind of try to stop this investigation or make it less public and not to kind of go against Zelensky and his associates. So there is also kind of different pressure on NABU from different sides.
That just makes the whole situation even more complicated, because the decision-making power is not in the hands of the politicians either in Kiev nor in Washington. It also rests with these special interest organizations. Maybe this is one of the explanations why Donald Trump is conducting so much of this diplomacy out in the open, in front of the eyes of the public, because you need to create pressure on the institutions to fall in line with the plans published.
I'm not sure, again, this is, I think, very interesting, this story, how this plan became public. Because
Yes.
I researched this war very closely. I follow Ukrainian politics professionally, so I follow all the news. And I saw this plan first, again, made public text of this plan was published by Ukrainian media and by Ukrainian politician who's member of parliament of Ukraine in Ukrainian language. So it was published on social media by Ukrainian media organizations and by Ukrainian bloggers and by this politician who is actually a member of Poroshenko faction. And so they published this plan in Ukrainian language after a visit by United States representative, this head of U.S. Army, basically, who visited Ukraine and presented Zelensky with this plan. And this is when this plan, text of this plan became public, and I immediately posted this plan and text in English translation and original Ukrainian language, kind of screenshot of this plan on my X account and my Facebook account, and it became viral and so on. And this is again kind of I think this plan was revealed and leaked. This was, I think, very likely it was leaked by kind of people within kind of Zelensky government, his administration, kind of specifically to try to sabotage this plan because they do not like these provisions, and that's why they wanted to kind of again use media as they did before in the West, and politicians and European Union officials to oppose this plan, and they, I think, succeeded to a large extent because kind of a lot of European Union politicians and media immediately called this plan capitulation and so on, and surrender of Ukraine and so on, which is not the case like Munich and so on, which is this is just kind of remarkable to see, because realistically this is kind of, I think, plan which is kind of I think Ukraine could not I think any other plan in the future, if Ukraine would refuse such plan, would be much worse on much worse conditions for Ukraine. And if Ukraine would change this plan as they try to do this now, Russia would not accept such plan.
Yeah.
So this means again the choice is very clear. It's basically a bad peace on terms which will be largely Russian terms because they win in this war, and or a possibility of capitulation, a real capitulation, defeat of Ukraine if this war would continue. Or even worse terms, which can again lead to kind of defeat of Ukraine and a loss of more territory and even worse conditions for Ukraine and many lives again of Ukrainians lost, as already happened with Istanbul peace deal, which again was blocked by the Western countries, and I think we now have similar efforts again by the West to try to block this new peace deal and possibility of realistic peace deal, and instead they kind of again try to sell fantasy of Ukraine, continue this war and fighting against Russia and winning against Russia or having stalemate, which is not a real possibility, and achieving peace deal on terms of United States and Ukraine, which is not realistic. And this is like kind of a real situation and not just this kind of all this fantasy which is presented by the media and politicians as a kind of real choices. There is no real choice basically for Ukraine to try to impose a peace deal kind of on Russia and for the West to do this, because Russia, I think, would not accept this, and so this is needs to be, I think, realized. But and I mentioned this I discussed this in my book as well. This is again. But I mean, I discussed Istanbul peace kind of negotiations, and now I think I see a lot of similar kind of efforts by the West to basically block this peace deal and or to make it not realistic.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think the factions inside the US and Europe that are trying to block this are probably currently in the driving seat, unfortunately, and sabotaging again a possibility to end the fighting and to bring about a constructive process to engage again in Ukraine, with Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. But Professor Katchanovski, people who want to follow you and want to read more from you, they should go to your Twitter. They should go to your. Should find your books. Is there another place where people should find your work?
Yes, I can send you links to my open access books. My recent book about Russia-Ukraine war, its origins from the Maidan to the Ukraine war, which is published and already has almost 100,000 views and downloads of entire book on the publisher website, and you have also similar number of downloads and views of chapters, individual chapters. They are free. Thanks to crowdfunding. Again, I use GoFund campaigns. Again, which is now almost close to completion, just I think several $100 left for this campaign. And because again, otherwise it would be very difficult to kind of, because of the media like blackouts, I decided to make this book also public, kind of publicly accessible, free for people to read. And there is also already, I think, a German translation of this book, and there are also other translations. So they can find my also my studies, which are open access on via these links, and also via my academic websites, which can be easily found, academia.edu and ResearchGate websites. But I think my books kind of, I think, would be on my Twitter. I'm very active also on Facebook about comments about all recent developments in Ukraine, and I do this as academic, as Ukrainian scholar who researched this conflict for a very long time, and I think this is also very important for me as Ukrainian scholar in Canada and also Canadian scholar, kind of to see what would happen with Ukraine, kind of, because this affects also. I have like my neighbor, for instance, and members of some distant relatives were killed in this war, and my neighbor was actually deserted from Ukrainian military, and he was captured and he was brought again for military training ground, and they found him in 5 days. After that, they found him dead with injuries, broken bones and injuries to his head, and so nobody again investigated this. Even so, this is like almost very likely that he was killed again during this military training in Western Ukraine, but again, no investigation, and even his family members were told not to even ask for investigation. So this is like total lawlessness, and you have like other people who visit Ukraine again in western part of Ukraine. They're also affected by this war. But again, this is why for me it's important kind of to see and study this war and to see how it can be resolved. And this is why I published this book, and I think I hope this book would make a contribution to kind of resolution of this war and ending this war, because any other alternative, again, with the exception of peace, would be even worse for Ukraine.
And I congratulate you. I congratulate you on your work. I congratulate you on making it open access available. Please also send me the links for your GoFundMe page. And everybody, if you want to support Professor Katchanovski, help him to finish his GoFundMe project, so that the book, these academic books, costs ridiculous amounts of money to publish them. We're talking about around $10,000 or like between 6,000 and 10,000, depending on the publisher, to make them open access available. It is ridiculous, but it is what we have to live with as academics with these presses. It is very important that you make that all available to the public, because it is the knowledge that is necessary to understand why and how this horrible war is working. And I congratulate you on your work, Professor Katchanovski. Thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.